Could a single man's reputation, built on the blood and dust of Tunisia and Sicily, be enough to paralyze the legendary Erwin Rommel and his formidable Atlantic Wall? General George Patton, the man whose name struck terror into the hearts of the German High Command, stood at the center of a grand illusion designed to break the Third Reich before a single soldier touched the beaches of France. This is the story of the Patton deception, the phantom army that shattered the Atlantic Wall, and the psychological masterstroke that outsmarted Erwin Rommel. By the early months of 1944, the tide of the Second World War had shifted, yet the most dangerous obstacle remained the liberation of Western Europe. The Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced a terrifying reality because the German defenses along the Atlantic Wall were growing stronger every day under the meticulous supervision of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel, the desert fox who had once danced through the sands of North Africa, was now fortifying the coast of France with millions of mines, steel tetrahedrons, and massive concrete bunkers designed to turn any invasion into a bloodbath. The Allies knew that a direct assault on the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route from England to France, was exactly what the Germans expected, and this expectation became the foundation for the most elaborate deception in military history. Central to this deception was General George S. Patton, a commander whose brilliance on the battlefield was matched only by his volatile personality and his knack for finding himself in trouble with his superiors. Following the slapping incidents in Sicily, Patton had been sidelined, a move that the German intelligence services found impossible to believe, because they viewed him as the best general the Allies possessed. Adolf Hitler himself was convinced that Patton would lead the primary invasion force, reasoning that the Americans would never leave their most aggressive cowboy commander on the bench during the most important operation of the war. The British and American intelligence agencies decided to weaponize this German obsession by creating the first United States Army Group, a massive but entirely fictional formation that existed only on paper, in radio waves, and in the form of inflatable decoys. This phantom army was supposedly stationed in Kent, directly across from the Pas-de-Calais, and to give it the ultimate stamp of authenticity, Eisenhower placed George Patton in command of this non-existent force. Just like that, the trap was set, and the Allies began a psychological warfare campaign that would consume the attention of the German High Command for months. While the real invasion force was secretly gathering in the southwest of England, Patton was seen publicly in the southeast, attending high-profile events and visiting troops to ensure that German spies reported his presence. The German military intelligence wing, the Abwehr, swallowed the bait whole because their entire strategic framework was built on the premise that where Patton went, the main blow would follow. Inside the German headquarters, Erwin Rommel was frantically preparing for the inevitable blow, yet he was constantly torn between his intuition and the reports landing on his desk. Rommel believed that the Allies might land in Normandy, but the sheer weight of evidence pointing toward Patton and the Pas-de-Calais forced him to keep the powerful 15th Army stationed in the north. This was the genius of Operation Fortitude South. It did not just create a lie, but it reinforced a pre-existing German bias that was so strong, it blinded them to the movement of millions of tons of real equipment just a few hundred miles away. The execution of this deception required a level of detail that bordered on the absurd, as the Allies deployed the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit comprised of artists, actors, and sound engineers instead of traditional combat soldiers. These men were tasked with creating the physical evidence of an army of 1 million men, and they did so by deploying hundreds of inflatable rubber tanks that looked perfectly real from the high altitude of German reconnaissance planes. They moved these tanks under the cover of night, using air compressors to inflate them in minutes, and even went so far as to use bulldozers to create fake tank tracks in the mud to ensure that any German pilot looking down would see a bustling military camp. Immediately, the airwaves became a battlefield of their own as the Allies utilized spoof radio to simulate the chatter of a massive army group preparing for embarkation. Radio operators mimicked the signatures of different units, sending out mundane reports about weather, food supplies, and troop movements that were carefully scripted to be intercepted by German listening posts. The complexity was staggering because every piece of fake data had to correlate with the physical decoys on the ground, creating a seamless narrative of a massive invasion force led by Patton that was just days away from crossing the English Channel. But the deception went even deeper than rubber tanks and radio static, as the Allies used double agents to feed the Germans a constant stream of top-secret information that confirmed their worst fears. One of the most famous agents, Joan Pujol Garcia, known by the code name Garbo, managed to convince the Germans that he had a network of 27 sub-agents reporting on every move the Allies made. In reality, these agents were fictional, and Garbo was working directly with British intelligence to feed the German high command exactly what they wanted to hear. Rommel, meanwhile, was exhausted, spending his days inspecting the Rommel's asparagus wooden poles planted in fields to prevent glider landings, and his nights studying maps that seemed to show a growing threat in the east. He knew that if the Allies established a beachhead, the war was lost. Yet he could not convince Hitler to release the panzer divisions held in reserve, because the Führer was convinced that the Normandy landings would be a mere diversion for the real attack led by Patton at Calais. The psychological pressure on Patton himself was immense, as he was a man who lived for the glory of combat, but was now forced to play the role of a shadow, a decoy whose primary job was to be seen but never to fight. He felt the weight of the millions of lives that depended on the success of this lie, and his personal diaries from this period reveal a man frustrated by his forced inactivity, yet fully aware of the stakes involved. Patton knew that if he slipped up, if a single German spy caught him in the wrong place, or if his true movements were tracked, the entire house of cards would collapse, and the invasion of Normandy would be met by the full force of the German army. Suddenly, the date for the real invasion drew closer, and the tension in the Allied command reached a breaking point as they realized that the deception had worked almost too well. The Germans were so convinced of the threat at Pas-de-Calais that they were pouring their best resources into that sector, leaving Normandy defended by second-tier divisions and coastal batteries. However, the risk remained that once the first Allied boots hit the sand in Normandy, the Germans would realize the mistake and rush their reserves south. To prevent this, the Allies had to maintain the lie even after the invasion had begun, keeping Patton and his Ghost Army as a credible threat for weeks following D-Day. The technical mastery of the Ghost Army was on full display as they used massive speakers mounted on trucks to broadcast the sounds of moving tanks and construction crews, sounds that could be heard for miles across the water. This sonic deception was so effective that German patrols often reported the movement of entire armored divisions that simply did not exist. Every detail, from the unit patches worn by soldiers in local pubs to the fake wedding announcements in Kentish newspapers, was part of a meticulously crafted reality designed to deceive a single man, Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a man who prided himself on understanding his opponent's mind, but in the case of Patton, he was fighting a ghost of his own making, a reflection of his own tactical aggression that the Allies had turned against him. The Desert Fox was being outmaneuvered not by superior firepower, but by superior imagination, as the Allies exploited the rigid hierarchy and the paranoid nature of the Nazi command structure. Hitler's refusal to delegate authority meant that once he was convinced of a certain strategy, it was nearly impossible for his generals to change his mind, and the Allies used this to lock the German reserves in place. As the final hours before June 6, 1944 approached, the Ghost Army reached its peak activity, with Patton making highly publicized appearances that suggested he was on the verge of boarding a ship. The Germans watched, they listened, and they waited for the hammer to fall on the Pas-de-Calais, while the real Allied fleet began to slip out of their harbors in the dead of night, heading toward the coast of Normandy. The greatest gamble in the history of warfare was about to be tested, and the life of every soldier on those landing craft depended on the German High Command's continued belief in a man and an army that were nothing more than smoke and mirrors. The immense silence that blanketed the English Channel on the eve of June 6, 1944, was not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating weight of expectation that pressed down upon the shoulders of every commander from London to Berlin. As the massive Allied fleet slipped their moorings and began the perilous crossing toward the coast of France, the success of the entire operation rested not on the caliber of the naval guns or the courage of the paratroopers, but on the continued effectiveness of a lie that had been months in the making. The German High Command, led by the brilliant yet increasingly isolated Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, remained fixated on the Pas-de-Calais, convinced by every scrap of intelligence they received that the true invasion would be led by the one man they feared above all others, General George S. Patton. This was the moment where the phantom and the reality were poised to collide, yet the phantom was so well constructed that even as the first Allied boots touched the sand in Normandy, the Germans refused to believe their eyes because they were still looking for the ghost of Patton in the east. Immediately as the sun began to rise over the chaotic surf of Omaha and Utah beaches, the German defensive apparatus should have swung into a pre-planned, devastating counter-response, but instead it found itself paralyzed by a strategic hesitation that was directly manufactured by the Ghost Army. Reports of the landings reached the headquarters of the German 7th Army, but the message was filtered through a lens of skepticism because the German intelligence officers were still monitoring the massive yet non-existent radio traffic of Patton's 1st United States Army Group in Kent. They were convinced that the thousands of ships hitting Normandy were an elaborate diversion, a bloody feint designed to draw the elite panzer divisions away from the real landing site at Calais, where they believed Patton was waiting for the perfect weather to launch his armored spearhead. This psychological anchoring was so powerful that Adolf Hitler's staff refused to wake him for hours, fearing his wrath if they interrupted his sleep for what they considered to be a minor coastal skirmish rather than the decisive battle of the war. Just like that, the window of opportunity for a German counterattack began to close as the Allied bridgehead grew from a thin line of desperate men into a solid wall of industrial might. Yet the deception continued to evolve to meet the changing needs of the battlefield. The men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were working overtime, moving their inflatable tanks and sonic trucks to new positions that suggested a second, even larger force was embarking for the Pas-de-Calais. They used high-powered speakers to broadcast the sounds of heavy machinery and the clanking of tank treads toward the French coast, sounds that were picked up by German listening posts and interpreted as the final preparations for Patton's departure. The German 15th Army, a force of nearly 250,000 elite troops, remained rooted in their bunkers at Calais, watching an empty sea and listening to the ghosts of an army that existed only in the imaginations of the Allied deceivers. The psychological duel between the Allied planners and Erwin Rommel reached a fever pitch during these critical first 48 hours, as Rommel frantically tried to reconcile his tactical instincts with the mountain of proof pointing toward Patton. Rommel had spent months fortifying the coast, but he was a man who believed in the decisive day, and he knew that if the panzers were not released to crush the Normandy beachhead immediately, the war would be lost. However, he was fighting against a military hierarchy that was shackled by its own rigid intelligence protocols and a Führer who was obsessed with the idea that the Allies would take the shortest route to Germany. The deception had created a feedback loop where the Germans only accepted information that confirmed their existing fears, making them the unwitting architects of their own destruction as they held back their most powerful units to defend against a phantom. Suddenly, the focus shifted to the inner turmoil of General George Patton himself, who was forced to remain in England as a high-profile decoy, while his peers and rivals were winning glory on the fields of France. Patton was a man of action, a warrior who believed he was a reincarnated soldier from ancient wars, and to be sidelined as a piece of stagecraft was perhaps the greatest sacrifice he ever made for the Allied cause. He spent his days inspecting real troops that were destined for Normandy, but he had to do so in a way that ensured German spies would see him as the commander of the fictional force, a role he played with a mixture of professional discipline and personal agony. He knew that every day he remained a ghost. He was saving the lives of the men fighting in the hedgerows. Yet his heart burned to lead his tanks into the fray and prove to Rommel once and for all who was the superior master of mobile warfare. But the deception was not just about Patton. It was about a meticulously coordinated symphony of misinformation that included everything from fake unit patches to fabricated wedding announcements in local British newspapers that mentioned soldiers from non-existent divisions. The Allies even went so far as to create fake troop hospitals and supply depots using hollow wooden frames and canvas to simulate vast quantities of material that German reconnaissance pilots dutifully photographed and reported back to Berlin. This visual evidence was the final nail in the coffin of German strategy, as it provided a tangible reality to the radio lies, making it impossible for the German high command to dismiss the threat at Calais even as the situation in Normandy became desperate. The complexity of this operation required a level of interagency cooperation between the British and Americans that was unprecedented, proving that the most effective weapon in the Allied arsenal was not a bomb or a tank, but the ability to speak with a single, deceptive voice. Immediately following the first week of the invasion, The Allies realized that they needed to extend the life of the lie to prevent a German shift toward Normandy, and they did so by deploying Rupert dummy paratroopers across various sectors of France. These small burlap dolls were equipped with explosive charges that mimicked the sound of rifle fire upon landing, creating the illusion of massive airborne drops in areas where no Allied troops were actually present. German patrols spent precious hours hunting these ghost paratroopers through the woods, further confusing the German commanders about the true scale and location of the Allied objectives. Every resource the Germans spent chasing shadows was a resource not used against the real soldiers, struggling to break out of the Normandy pocket, a tactical trade-off that favored the Allies at every turn. The technical brilliance of the Ghost Army engineers was matched by the audacity of the double agents like Garbo, who continued to feed the Germans a narrative of a major operation yet to come, even as the Allied forces in Normandy reached 1 million men. Garbo's reports were so highly valued by the Germans that he was actually awarded the Iron Cross by the Nazi regime while he was working in London to destroy them. A supreme irony that highlights the total success of the Allied intelligence network. He convinced the Germans that the Normandy landings were a trap designed to lure the panzers away so that Patton could strike at the heart of the Reich through Calais. A lie so compelling that Hitler personally ordered the 15th Army to stay put for 7 weeks after D-Day had already begun. Just like that, the tension broke in late July during Operation Cobra, when the real George Patton was finally unleashed upon the German lines, and the Phantom Army was replaced by a tidal wave of American steel. Patton's Third Army moved with a speed and violence that the Germans were unprepared for, as they had spent so much energy worrying about where he might land that they were unable to stop him once he was actually on the ground. Patton's tanks bypassed German strongpoints, cut off supply lines, and sowed such chaos that the German defense of France collapsed in a matter of weeks, transforming the war of attrition into a war of movement that played directly into Patton's strengths. The Desert Fox's Atlantic Wall was not just breached, it was bypassed and rendered irrelevant by a combination of physical force and psychological warfare that left the German generals reeling in confusion. Inside the crumbling German headquarters, the realization that they had been comprehensively fooled began to sink in, leading to a breakdown in trust between Hitler and his field commanders that would have fatal consequences for the Third Reich. Rommel, who had seen his warnings ignored and his reserves held back by the Patton threat, became disillusioned with Hitler's leadership, a sentiment that eventually drew him into the circles of the German resistance. The deception had not only won the Battle of Normandy, but had also contributed to the internal destabilization of the German military command, proving that a well-placed lie can be as destructive as a 1,000-pound bomb. The psychological impact of being outmaneuvered by a phantom was a blow to the German professional ego that resonated all the way to the bunkers of Berlin. Immediately as the war in Europe drew to a close, the story of the Ghost Army and the Patton deception was buried in the most secret archives of the Allied nations, as the techniques used were deemed too valuable to be revealed to the public or potential future enemies. The artists, actors, and engineers who had comprised the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were sworn to a silence that would last for half a century, returning to their civilian lives without the recognition or glory afforded to the combat divisions. Yet their contribution was perhaps the most significant force multiplier of the war, as they had effectively removed an entire German army group from the board without firing a single shot, a feat of military genius that deserves a place alongside the greatest battles in history. The final months of Erwin Rommel's life were a tragic postscript to the deception, as he was forced to choose between a public trial and a state funeral after being implicated in the plot against Hitler, a plot driven in part by the strategic failures he witnessed during the invasion. Rommel's suicide in October 1944 marked the end of an era for the German military, as its most respected leader was eliminated by the very regime he had tried to save from its own delusions. Patton, conversely, became the face of the Allied victory in Europe, but his own journey ended abruptly in a car accident in December 1945. Just as the world was beginning to grasp the full scale of the war he had helped to win through both his presence and his absence. Looking back across the decades, the Patton deception stands as the ultimate example of the art of war, where the goal is to subdue the enemy without fighting or to make them fight a ghost while you strike them from the shadows. The inflatable tanks may have been made of rubber, but the strategic victory they secured was as solid as the granite of the Normandy cliffs. and the lives they saved are a living legacy of the power of human ingenuity. The liberation of Europe was not just a victory of industrial production or numbers, but a victory of the mind, where the Allies proved they could outthink the most disciplined military machine in history by exploiting the very fears they had helped to create. The men of the Ghost Army used their creativity to serve a cause greater than themselves, turning the tools of art and theater into weapons of war that blinded a tyrant and paralyzed his armies. Their story challenges our understanding of what it means to be a soldier, proving that a paintbrush can be as effective as a bayonet and that a well-crafted radio script can change the course of a continent. As we stand on the beaches of Normandy today, we must look not just at the sand and the sea, but at the horizon toward Calais and remember the army that wasn't there, the general who was a phantom, and the lie that brought down an empire. The lessons of Operation Fortitude and the Ghost Army are more relevant today than ever, as the battlefields of the 21st century increasingly shift toward the digital and psychological realms where perception is often more important than reality. The ability to control the narrative, to deceive the enemy's sensors, and to exploit their psychological biases remains the cornerstone of modern strategic thought, all of which find their roots in the grassy fields of Kent and the beaches of northern France in 1944. Patton's ghost still haunts the halls of military academies, a reminder that the greatest weapon a commander can possess is the reputation that precedes him into battle. Ultimately, the victory of the Allies was a victory of truth over falsehood, yet it was achieved through the most sophisticated and daring lie ever told in the history of human conflict. The Patton deception was the masterstroke that shattered the Atlantic Wall, outsmarted the Desert Fox, and paved the road to Berlin, ensuring that the light of democracy would once again shine over the ruins of a broken Europe. It is a story of shadows, of rubber tanks and silent heroes, and of a general who became a legend not just for what he did, but for what the enemy thought he was going to do. A legacy that will forever endure in the annals of World War II. If you were Erwin Rommel, would you have fallen for the Patton deception? Or were the signs of the Normandy invasion too obvious to ignore? Let us know your tactical analysis in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.